Is Konsta Helenius just Finnish William Eklund? We profile the forward on today's episode.
You're Locked On Sharks, your daily podcast on the San Jose Sharks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to Locked On Sharks, the premier hockey podcast of your favorite team in the Bay Area. My name is JD Young, contributor at San Jose Hockey Now. I want to thank you for making Locked On Sharks your first listen. Proudly part of the Locked On Network. We cover your team every day. If you want to be an everydayer, all you have to do is just follow wherever you get podcasts, or you can watch this on YouTube as well. And today we are back with another draft profile as we're starting to kind of fill in all the guys who could be potentially there for the Pittsburgh Penguins pick. So you've almost basically got the top 15 on lock here. So we're going to be digging into another one of these. We have a first-time guest, Alex Appleyard, who does work over at Smaht Scouting. So he joins where we're going to discuss Konsta Helenius, where he would fit in with the Sharks, kind of what makes him so intriguing. And then we'll get Alex's thoughts on the 2024 draft. So before we get into all that, do want to let you guys know that today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. It's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And now we bring in Alex Appleyard of Smaht Scouting. Alex, how's it going, buddy?
Yeah, not too bad. I'm actually sat in sunny Lisbon in Portugal right now, so weather's up at like 30 degrees today, so not too bad. Probably not that dissimilar from San Jose, actually.
Yeah, I mean, California, we've been kind of hit with some wet weather this weekend, but it's supposed to start drying up here, and summer is right around the corner for us. So one guy who could be right around the corner for the San Jose Sharks, a very intriguing prospect, one Konsta Helenius. If you don't know who that is, he's a forward playing in the Liga, 5'11", 181 pounds in 57 games, including his playoffs. Has 16 goals, 26 assists, 231 shots on goal. So I ask you, Alex, what makes Helenius such an intriguing prospect?
I think the most intriguing part of his whole skill set is really his hockey IQ. You know, I think especially for a guy who does play up the middle, I know he's listed as a right winger in a lot of places, and I think some people might have him slightly lower on their draft boards, partially as a result of that. But this year he's played far more center than he has winger, and his hockey IQ is really up there amongst the best in this draft. I think he's got kind of elite anticipation. He sees passing lanes that no one else sees, and he uses it to dictate play quite well as well. You know, he's kind of the guy who's always like half a stride ahead of the play. So I would say that's the thing that really makes him stand out. And on top of that, he's not an incredible skater, although I don't think he's quite as slow as some people think. I would say he's an above average speed guy, but he has kind of a shorter stride, and it makes him at times look a bit slower. But he's a fantastic transition player, and as a result, he's driven play incredibly well this year. When you start kind of delving into the statistics, he's, you know, in the regular season he was at 55% Corsi, and then in the postseason he's been at 60% so far. So I would say the IQ, the play driving, and also his like kind of crisp, accurate, deceptive passing are really the things that make him stand out.
Is he just Finnish William Eklund? Because that's exactly what he sounds like, just from what you talk about. Eklund, who played center, of course, but has moved to wing here. But it sounds a lot like the same type of player.
He's not a million miles away. Both of them, actually. I liked Eklund quite a lot in his draft year, and I think Helenius isn't maybe quite. I don't think Helenius quite has the ceiling that Eklund has. I do think in William Eklund there's a potential for the guy to be a really elite player up at 90 points, etc. I'm not sure Helenius quite has that as his ceiling. I think he's kind of a touch below that. But I do think that it's not out of the realms of possibility for Helenius to end up kind of a 75 to 85 point forward in the NHL. We'll see if that's at center or at wing. I think there's a lot of teams who might kick him out to right wing if they draft him and kind of develop him as a winger. But I think with his IQ and his passing, it makes sense to try and see what a team have in him in center, because there's an outside chance. I mean, not even an outside chance. I think there's a decent chance that he can be a 1C. Maybe not, a top 10, 15 1C in the NHL, but a guy who's kind of in this 20, 25th best center in the league range.
So what do you think is going to be, as he continues his development, what do you think is going to be the one skill that, other than his hockey IQ, what do you think is going to be the one skill that makes him an NHL player?
I think the things that he kind of needs to improve, probably, although he's pretty well rounded in general, I would say that if he just keeps developing normally, he'll play NHL.
Yep.
Even if he doesn't develop any exceptional pathway, even if it's just a normal pathway from here, he's going to be at least a 60-point, probably 50-point NHL second liner if his development goes, just standard, very, very normal trajectory. But the two things I would say that stand out is he's kind of shifty and agile, but he could do with improving his stride and in turn getting a bit faster. I don't think his skating is going to hold him back, but it might stop him becoming a really kind of elite player instead of just a very good top six player. And I think the other thing is he has a pretty good shot. He's good at getting it off, especially. I mean, the shot volume he produces is quite impressive, and he has a really good one-timer when he gets it off from the left half wall, but he only usually gets his one-timer off on the power play. And his wrist shot, at times, he kind of struggles to get it off from in close with velocity. Like, he'll get it off, but, you're talking like 50 mile an hour shots instead of wrists that are 70, 80 plus. That when you get to the NHL level, you need to have that extra velocity generally to beat a goalie, although he's deceptive enough to kind of deal without it. And I think that's part of why he shot 6.6% on the year. Now, I would kind of go on to say that I do think his point total this year was slightly suppressed versus where it could be because of his 6.6 shot percentage. Because while he isn't the best shooter, he certainly isn't 6.6% bad at the legal level. So I do think, even though he had a very impressive point total, and it's getting more impressive with his playoff stats so far, but 0.71 points per game for a draft eligible guy in Liga it's not easy to do. In the last like 35 years, the names who've done that are pretty much like Olli Jokinen, Mikael Granlund, Alex Barkov, Patrick Laine, and Kaapo Kakko. And of those 5 guys, 4 out of 5 of them were top 3 picks. 4 out of 5 of them have become consistent 65 plus point NHL players. And Kakko does have a chance to make it 5 out of 5 of that. He's still a developing player. So when you see the names, when you see the production, it's impressive to begin with. And then when you think, if life was fair, he probably would have shot like 9% on the season or something and had an extra 3 or 4 goals, and it would have been even more impressive. There's a lot to like with him. And I would say that on top of obviously like not being the fastest and not having an incredible shot, I think the one thing that makes people think that he might not be able to fulfill the level of potential is because apart from his IQ, he doesn't really, and passing as well, he doesn't really stand out as an exceptional player. He doesn't have incredible hands, and I think that's one thing that is quite hard to improve upon. I think it's one of the hardest things to improve upon once you hit this 17, 18, 19 age group. Most of the things you can work on, but hands generally, if a kid's in juniors or pre-draft in Europe and has great hands, they're going to have at least very good hands at the NHL level, and if they have average hands, they're going to have average hands at the NHL level. So I think that's one thing that you can kind of say that he might never be a guy who's going to dangle around guys, but you don't really need that to be a good top 6 center.
Yeah, and kind of going back to the skating, right, where you mentioned maybe it won't ever be like a top skill, like top end kind of burner type of guy, but you see a lot of these guys as they add more strength, right, and they they kind of continue to fill out their bottom, the kind of lower core. You'll see the strength improve and stuff, and the skating improve, and like you don't have to be a phenomenal skater to make it in the NHL, especially if you can, as you mentioned, his IQ, you can read the plays beforehand. You kind of have that sixth sense of like, oh, I know where the puck's going to be, or I know where guys are going to be. I think that can kind of help offset again. And you said he's going to be a average skater to maybe above average skater, but never like a top end burner. So the skating doesn't worry me. I think the brains, right? That's what's makes him such an intriguing player, is how he thinks the game, and especially with the Sharks, the way they've drafted with guys like Eklund and Borlo, where they think the game so well. And then, you add like a Will Smith who thinks the game and can do that. It makes a lot of sense to continue to add a piece like Helenius to it. So, all right, before we continue with Alex, and we talk about Helenius, where he would kind of fit in the Sharks prospect pool, compare him to Mikael Granlund, of course, the Finnish forward on San Jose, kind of how those two guys stack up. Just need to take a quick break here. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed It's $150, win or lose, but on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all an app that's safe, secure, and easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Looking at his potential timeline, right? And I think with the European players is always interesting because you're not kind of bound as much with like CHL junior players or NCAA players, like where they're kind of a little bit more free to come make that jump to the US. So when do you expect what do you expect with this timeline? Do you expect another year or two in the Liga and then maybe jump over to the AHL? Kind of like where do you see his path?
Well, I think he could do with potentially another year. Don't get me wrong. I actually think he could play in the NHL now. He wouldn't excel, but he could probably play in like a third line role and put up 25 points and not be a liability defense.
Survive
on the wing. Probably on the wing.
Yeah.
But
yeah,
I think you don't really want him to be forced into that position because it might compromise his overall potential. I think he's under contract next year, although he's under contract at Tappara instead of Jukurit, where he played because he's been on loan all year. So it wouldn't shock me if he just went back there and was pretty much the best player in Liga next year. And the one thing I would say about his physical maturity, people like to point out that he's 5'10", 5'11", and 180 pounds. But he has a big brother. He's only 2.5 years older than him. And his big brother's just over 6 foot and around 210 pounds. And you can see the frame Helenius has on him that he's not going to be a guy he's not going to be a Travis Konechny, like smaller guy who is probably 180 pounds. Even if he only is 5'11", he's going to be up in like the Crosby range of, a 200-pound guy who's 5'11", who's really strong on his skate. So I'm not someone who really considers his size to be an issue in general because he might be 5'11", but he's not going to be a small player in the NHL because of his leverage and because of lower body strength.
Yeah. No, I don't care about size either. I mean, as long as you're a good player, that's all I care about. Are you a good player? Can you be a good player? And even like Mikael Granlund, right? We've seen him. He's 5'10", but he's sturdy and stocky, and he did a really great job with the Sharks, especially this year with nobody around. And he's had a 60-point season with the Sharks this year, and was their MVP on the worst team in the NHL. But still, he was a very good player on a very bad team. And I kind of am curious. Do you see like a Mikael Granlund type of role for Helenius, or like kind of comparing the two of them? I know it's not fair just to compare Finnish players because they're Finnish players, but I think that's the natural for Sharks fans, right? Is cool, we have Mikael Granlund. Can we get Mikael Granlund 2.0?
I think he has the potential to be a better player than Granlund eventually. He might take a bit of time to get there, but I do think that while Granlund has a high IQ, I think Helenius might have a even higher IQ. So I do think there is potential to be a like true 1C there. I think Granlund, isn't quite that 1C level. Really, he's a good 2C. Like solid 2C, on average year on year, he might be the 40th best center in the NHL or 35th. Whereas I think Helenius might be in that, 20 to 25 range if he hits the top end of his potential. And if he doesn't, I think he will just be a solid second line player at very worst.
All right. So where would he potentially fit in the Sharks? Assuming, fingers crossed, they win the lottery, they get Celebrini, who would be their 1C. You have Will Smith, who could, it's either going to play wing or potentially slide in as a 2C. Having a guy like Helenius, and then you have like Phil Beestead, who just had a really nice season. David Edstrom, like kind of being a potential second line winger for a guy like Will Smith, or kind of where would you slot him in?
I mean, it's always difficult when we speak in a few years away. I mean, it's always nice to have more bullets in the chamber, and I think that if they drafted him, would be exactly what it is. It's a guy who can play wing, generally right wing, but also is a solid center. So I think it's one of those things where if you were going to roll that dice, you roll that dice and wait a couple of years. But he's the kind of player who might be able to be an NHL player in a middle six role in 2025, 26. So you wouldn't probably have to wait that long for him to actually contribute because he's already playing against men and he's doing a good job against men. And recently he also played for the national team for the first time, senior national team. He played 2 games against Latvia, I think last week. Don't know what day of the week it is. Are we on Monday? If so, last week. And he got 3 assists in 2 games and was one of the Finnish national team's better players. Against Latvia aren't an all-star team, but they have some quite good European League players, guys who've played in the NHL or good AHLers, and the Finnish national team.
Rudy Balcers, baby.
And the Finnish
fan favorite of Locked On Sharks for golf ballsters. But hey, sorry.
And the Finnish national team, has some of the best players in Europe. So the fact he was able to shine, and he's been able to shine in Liga as well, it stands him in really good stead.
All right. So you said probably another year or two in Liga before coming over. I know potentially playing in the NHL, but I think with Sharks, we've seen them being very patient with their prospects. William Eklund spent an entire season in the AHL. I think that's been the whole kind of Mike Greer mantra is overripen the prospects. So probably a year in the AHL, maybe just also getting used to the smaller ice and before making that NHL prospect. I'm also kind of curious with kind of guys like we always talk about the flash of substance, but his defense, right? Yes, maybe as a potential 1C, but do you think he could be turned into like an ace penalty killer? Kind of what do you potentially see from him as well?
I would say that right now he's above average defensively in Liga against men at center, which is really impressive. He has a really high level compete, great forechecker, works in all three zones really hard. And on top of that, his IQ transfers to the defensive zone. He doesn't quite have the IQ in the defensive zone, I think, that he has in the neutral zone and the offensive zone. But still, he perceives passes that other players are going to make. He gets in lanes really well. And while not overly physical, he's not scared to kind of get physically involved. So I actually saw that in the game against Latvia this week, kind of going into the boards with guys who are far bigger than him and not really worrying about it. So, it's never going to hold him back. It's always difficult, I think, when you're projecting some of the younger players in terms of like this defensive level at the NHL. But I do think he's a guy who could probably play on the penalty kill and be certainly above average defensively. Is never going to be an issue with him.
Yeah, and I think defense is one of those where like it's just the reps, right? Especially as younger kids, you don't really have to play much high-end defense. Usually you don't have to play much high-end defense. That doesn't really happen until you have to start to play against better competition, and then your defense will round out. And that's I think that's, especially with forwards, that's usually the last thing that kind of comes along, right? Is they've spent their whole life playing in the neutral zone, playing in the offensive zone, and then, I got to play defense every once in a while. So, but if you say he's got a solid foundation, at least, that's good to hear where he can be that full 200-foot player that we know Mike Greer is looking for. So, all right, before we finish up with Alex, we get into the 2024 draft. We kind of figure out who he's got ranked in the top 5, look at some potential picks for the Penguins, and then, of course, try to figure out where he thinks Helenius goes in the draft. Just need to take a quick break. I know the NHL season's almost over, and it has been a tough one for Sharks fans, but regardless of that, you can still win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleepers are our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick your favorite superstars or studs in the NHL. You can go guys like McDavid, you can go McKinnon, Carr, whoever you want to root for, especially in the playoffs here, and record more or less in their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus minus more in a given game. To win 100 times bet on Sleeper, you need to correctly predict the outcome of 8 player stats. You heard me, Sharks fans, you can still win 100 times your money playing daily fantasy hockey with Sleeper. So start paying attention and nail your picks so you can start winning big. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Let's jump over to the 2024 NHL draft. Alex, I haven't been able to, it's your first time on, haven't been able to hear your opinions. So we know it's Macklin Celebrini's world, and we're all just living in it. He's going to be the projected first overall. And the big question in this draft is how does 2 through 5 slot out? So how do you have 2 through 5 slotting out? Kind of where do you go?
Personally, for me, 2 and 3, I think are quite easy. I mean, I would say they're semi-interchangeable for me, but I would go Demidov second. I think he's the second most talented player in the draft. There's an extremely high chance that he's going to be an elite forward, 90 plus points. He's extreme. Yep. He's so high skilled. I wouldn't say he's quite, like Michkov level, who he's always compared to because they're the same youth team. They're really good friends. He's the year below him, but he's not far away. And he could be a very, very, very good forward in the NHL. And I think for me, third is Berkeley Catton. I know that's probably above where most people have him. but while he's small, that's the only thing that I think can hold him back. He's an incredible offensive player, and I think he can stick at center in the NHL. And obviously, it's always like, oh, he's a Canadian smaller center, but it wouldn't shock me if he ended up being kind of in the top end of his game. Might be up there with like, a guy like Braden Point, like 100-point player who is the team's 1C. I wouldn't bet on it, but I think there's a 20% chance that he ends up at that level, and a 50% chance he ends up as an 85+ point center because he's just that good. And then as for
the Sabres are just going to draft him again, draft Zach Benson 2.0, right? It's just going to happen. So, all right, sorry. Who do you have for 4 and 5?
That's a bit more difficult, if I'm perfectly honest. I think in this range, there's a lot of guys who are quite a similar level, and I think in this range, it's for me, I would probably go with one of the defensemen. Maybe Levshinov is in terms of the overall package the safest there. In terms of he has a really strong offensive game. His defensive game needed a bit of work this year in the NCAA. He's a bit reckless at times and sometimes gets a bit lost in the defensive zone. But when you look at his overall physical skill set and his offensive skill set and what he can do in the defensive zone when he's kind of switched on, he's an impressive player. And then 5, that's a really difficult one. My gut tells me Zane Parekh because I love his game and I think he can be a point per game defenseman in the NHL. But my brain probably tells me to be a bit safer and go for someone more like Zeev Buium, who has really high offensive upside, but is also a bit safer defensively. Probably off the board a bit as well. I can see why people would select someone like Sam Dickinson there. I can see Caden Lindstrom, also a very good player. But that's kind of the rough range. I do think for me this like 4 to 8 range is quite congested and a lot of really good players in close there.
You mentioned somebody who definitely makes my heart aflutter, Zeev Buium, who I'm hoping the Sharks will be able to get with that Penguins pick, either if they have to trade up or how GMs love 6'4" right-handed shot defenseman. Hopefully Buium slides down a little bit, but what do you think? Like you mentioned him as a potential like 5 or 6 player. Buium, what? Speak about Buium and why Sharks fans we should be willing to sell it all to get Buium.
I do think he might end up slipping towards the back end of the top 10 or maybe even out of the top 10. I think him and Parekh are guys. Him and Parekh are guys. Yeah. Him and Parekh are guys who are slightly undersized. Their offensive game first. And I mean, in Buium's case, I don't think his defensive game is in any way an issue. I think he's above average defensively. But still, because of the size, he might fall. But what he's been doing in the NCAA is incredible offensively. And on top of that, to be able to walk into the NCAA and be a above average defensive player says everything about his game. And I do think he can be a 1D. I think he can be a guy who's a 50+ point NHL player who more than holds his own in the defensive zone. So yeah, I mean, for me as someone following the Flyers, I'd quite like him to be there wherever we're going to pick, be that 12 or who knows. I mean, might still be about 18 or 20 with one game to go as well. But he's an impressive player, and if he falls to 14, that would be incredible. But I don't think he will. I think around 12 is probably the latest he's going to get, simply because the centers, the 4 big centers in this draft, are, Celebrini, Catton, Lindstrom, and Helenius. I think all of those guys are going to probably be gone by 10. And then you have kind of 5 to 6 D-men. And, those 2 positions always have so much value. So Dickinson's going to be gone. I think Siliev, even though I probably disagree personally, will probably go top 10. Levshinov for sure will be gone. And then you've kind of got Buium, Parekh, and Yakemchuk, who I think all have a chance to go in this kind of top 12 range. And then you got to throw in those wingers as well. There's greentree like Iginla and Greentree who are very impressive as well. So I can't see a world where Buium falls to 14, although NHL GMs have surprised me before, and they'll definitely surprise me again.
All right, so you mentioned Siliev, who I know it's been projected. I've seen it as high as like 2 or 3 to, and some people have him kind of early 20s. He's the big 6'7" Russian. What kind of maybe it makes you a little bit more cooler on him that you're like not up there in the top 5 with him?
I just don't see the offensive skill set for him to be a standout number 1 defenseman. There's lots of people who've thrown out the name Victor Hedman in comparison to him. And quite frankly, don't want to be rude, but I just have to laugh at that. Because when you watch Victor Hedman play in at 16, 15 years old, he had a better offensive skill than Siliev at 18 years old. You know, the guy was playing SAL at 17 years old and putting up more than half a point a game. It's a totally different universe than Siliev. He had a really nice start to the season, but he doesn't create that much offense on his own. And when you watched him at the MHL level, you know, the Russian under-20s, he doesn't stand out in the offensive zone either. And therefore, it's difficult for me to see him being more than maybe a 30, 35-point defenseman. And look, don't get me wrong, if he's 6'7", he skates fantastically with a plus defensive game, that guy who's a 30-point player can be, you know, a number one. But I don't think they're a top 15, 20 defensemen in the NHL. They're an ideal number two who can be a number one on a strong pairing in a strong top four without a standout guy. So that, for me, is why I can understand why people potentially salivate over him, because, you know, you see that size,
he's very tall,
skating, and you think, you know, who else is that tall and skates that well? You know, you've got like Hedman and Pronger, but he's not those guys, because those guys have twice the offensive ability that he does. So that's why I'm a bit cold on him. Though I would say that in a world where he fell to 14, he'd be a great pick there. But I mean, he's not going to.
Yeah, it's all about the value, right? Like you know, it's like getting that player at 3 or getting that same player at 14 is a much different value there. So we'll get you out of here with these last 2 questions. So other than Macklin and Celebrini, who do you think is going to be 5 years from now? Who do you think is going to be the best player in the draft?
If I was betting, I'd say Demidov. It's a toss-up between him and Katten. But I do think this draft's slightly underrated in its own way, just because last year was so good. But there's a good 5 or so guys who I could clearly see in 5 years' time being like, you know, 60+ point defensemen or 1Cs, or point per game plus wingers. And I think for me, those guys are Celebrini, Demidov, Katten, Buium, Levshinov, and maybe an outside chance of someone like Perek. So yeah, but I would bet on Demidov, quite frankly.
Our good friend Will Scout said he's like a potential Hall of Fame player already, and so no, that Demidov is usually the pick there. So no worries on that. All right, last question: where in the draft does Helenius go?
If I think he goes 7 to 10. I think 10's about as low as he's going to fall. And unless someone really loves him, I don't see him going higher than kind of this 6 or 7 range, just because of the amount of defenseman there and the fact that you've got a guy like Lidstrom as well, who's going to be there. I think in terms of the centers, he's probably slotted at 4th best on most NHL's teams lists. So I think he's a more talented player maybe than Lidstrom in some ways, but you can see the appeal of a guy who skates like Lidstrom at his size with that shot. You know, you can understand why scouts get really excited about him, because if he hits, he's going to be a monster in the NHL. And he's, you know, thinks the game really well as well. So I think Helenius is going to be 4th off the board amongst the centers. And for me, 4th off the board amongst the centers probably means about 8, 9, 10, given the defensemen available in this draft.
All right, we'll go 8. Congratulations, Seattle. Helenius would be a really nice pairing with Matty Beniers and Shane Wright down the middle. So that'd be a really fun combo. So Alex, thank you so much for your time. Where can the people find you, buddy?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at AV Appleyard, and also generally at Smaht Scouting. We've got obviously more reports coming out in the next few months for the draft, and we're going to have some final rankings at some point, and it will be, I guess, a top 100 with write-ups for everyone. So have a look there.
All right, thanks, buddy.
Yep. See you later, JB.
All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Alex on Konsta Helenius. I think, though, he might be a little bit ahead of where the Sharks' range is here, and they would probably have to move up for him. I could see them moving up, but if I'm moving up, I'm probably going for a defenseman, one of those blue chip defenseman guys. Whether one of maybe the big guys kind of falls and you move up to try to scoop him up, maybe you move up a couple spots to get a guy like Zeev Buium, whatever it is. But if Helenius does drop to the Sharks at, whatever that Pittsburgh pick is, you're going to have to think long and hard about adding another super talented guy who can, especially if the Sharks, if they get Celebrini and then you have Will Smith, this guy, I think, is one of those potential kind of glue guys. Basically, it's a William Eklund light to put on your second line. So you get William Eklund on line 1 and William Eklund light on line 2. That sounds great to me. So We'll continue our draft profiles, and as the season is almost over here, we'll start to ramp these up a bit more. So make sure you guys are following wherever you get podcasts. And of course, you can watch on YouTube as well. You can follow the show on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Locked On Sharks. Follow me on Twitter at MyFryhole. Until tomorrow, bye, friends.